All right, everyone. This is SANDCAST, beach volleyball with Bourne and Travis Mewhirter. My buddy Tri is off in off-season mode. He's in Hawaii, fresh off his first ever MVP award. He was the AVP MVP for the first time this year, so he's getting some much-deserved time in the waves in Hawaii. So I'm just going solo today, and I'm bringing on a fellow writer and author, Mr. Sean Murray, author of "If Gold Is Our Destiny," and I'm going to put in parentheses, "Then so be it," Chris Marlowe. How are we doing, Sean?
I'm great, Travis. Thanks for having me on the show. Yeah, exactly. So be it, as Chris
Yeah.
Marlowe said.
It's man, I mean, I thought it was so cool. The one of my favorite parts about reading books, and this is really any sports book. I just read a book on the USFL by Jeff Pearlman. I don't know if you've ever read anything that he's written. It is when you get these insider access and sort of the behind the scenes look at it. And you had access to Chris Marlowe's journals, which I thought was so cool. I'm interested in your just the reporting process that you went about with the book. Obviously, your dad, as you mentioned in the book, was a team psychologist with the team for quite a bit. But this book is obviously you grew up sort of within this culture, and then you came out with this book. What prompted you to write "If Gold Is Our Destiny" now?
Well, it all started with a gift from my wife, a book she gave me that she'd heard from someone else was really good. And it was called Boys in the Boat. I don't know if you read, it's about another American team. It was a crew team that won a gold medal in the 1936 Olympics, Berlin, also known as the Nazi Olympics. And this American team, which was really an underdog team, went up and they beat the Nazi boat, even though the Nazis were cheating and all this stuff. So it's just a great story. And I was really inspired by the story. And I come from the world of leadership development and organization development. I help companies develop cultures and help build winning teams and just help with organizations aligning their people and their talent for business success. And that's kind of the world that I'm in. And I teach these principles, but the people love to learn from sports stories. People absolutely love sport. I often hear, well, how would Michael Jordan do it? Or how did Bo Jackson get to be so great? Or, these guys, Tom Brady, why is he such a good leader? And so I thought, I'd like to tell a story or write a story about a team and really understand how they did it, how they became the best in the world. And I started thinking about different teams that I'd come across in my life. And this one that really popped out was this 1984 USA men's national volleyball team, Olympic team that went to the Los Angeles Olympics in 84. And I happened to be there. I was only 13 at the time, but I was at that Olympics. My dad, as you mentioned, had this connection, was the team sports psychologist, along with another gentleman or partner of his, Chuck Johnson. So my father, Don Murray, and Chuck Johnson together, they were helping Doug Beal, the head coach, and his coaching staff coach this group, as I call Mavericks, these really highly talented volleyball players, many of whom grew up on the beach, learning on the beach, and tried to help get them to play together as a team. And so that I had this memory of this team. And I knew they won gold. I also knew they went on to really dominate. It wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just a team that rose to the occasion, won one gold medal. They went on to win a World Cup, a World Championships, another gold medal in Seoul. They might have been able, if they could just have pulled it together a little bit longer, they almost took gold again in 92. So it was just a dominant dynastic team, and I wanted to study it. And I knew they'd been on this outward bound adventure. That sounded kind of interesting. And that's what prompted me. It got me to call Doug Beal, who I knew through my father, and ask him about the team. And that kind of got the ball rolling.
Yeah, and we both mentioned Doug Beal because I worked with him for my book that I wrote with Kent Steffes, Kings of Summer. I think that interviewing Doug is such a refreshing sort of breath of fresh air because he is able to look back at things so honestly, and he takes the emotions out of it. Doug was just so candid and so willing and free with his time, and you could tell that he just looks back and he's like, yeah, I mean, I messed up here. And what was interesting, is that the players, both the ones that I talked to for my book and the ones in "If Goal Is Our Destiny," they had a very similar review of Doug, that he wasn't a player's coach, but he got it done. He wasn't going to be your friend, but he took this team that was just moribund and frankly a bad national program and turned it into a dynastic one. And as someone who's so big into leadership development as you, I'm interested in what you learned from studying this team.
Well, I learned a lot from Doug Beal and studying Doug and how he led not just this team, but the program and really volleyball in the United States during those years. And he's just got such a long history. For those of you who don't know, he was also the head of executive director of USA Volleyball for many years, just retired, I think, in 2018. He got started with the sport in before high school. So I would say probably the late 50s, early 60s, something like that. So anyway, I learned a lot about Doug and his leadership. He is very open. He was willing to say, hey, I made mistakes here. I made mistakes there. I learned from this. But I guess some key lessons from Doug, he brought a sort of higher expectation to the program just by how he approached the program. So one of the things I noticed was he was very good at putting together a staff. He put together great people around him, and then that allowed him to look a little further and think about, how do I not just make this team successful, but how do I grow a program? How do I lay the foundation for something great in the United States? And that requires making connections in the business community and raising money and going out there and just being an ambassador to the sport and going to Olympic committees and sitting on committees so that you could make decisions that would help the program in some way. And he went out and he scheduled the team like 100 games in a couple of the years, which is unheard of now. The national team.
That's a big number.
Yeah. I think they play 20 or something, or 25. I mean, it's like, he thought big and he did big things, and he accomplished a lot of big things, and he did it by putting some great people around him. And then he was strategic. He was visionary. He could look further. And just some people can do that. And that's just pure leadership. And that was the leadership part. But he also, he put together a good team. He did get into the X's and O's and work with his team on how do we come together? How do we develop an American system? How do we take these beach volleyball players that grew up playing on the beach 2-on-2? Some of them were quote unquote uncoachable, according to some people in the program, but they won a gold medal together. So it's an amazing story.
And one of the things that I think that Doug Beal, and really this goes back to Karl McGowan and Bill Neville before him, was that they were so far ahead of their time in that they weren't trying to assemble the best team or the best players. They were trying to assemble the best team. And I feel like the first example that I can think of who did that was Herb Brooks with that 1980 Miracle on Ice team, where he cut some of the best players because they weren't necessarily cohesive. And then they were also sort of ahead of their time with just having your dad and Chuck Johnson on the staff as sports psychologists. I mean, sports psychology, mindfulness, meditation, it's having its moment now, but they were half a century ahead of their time. It was just, it feels like it was such a prescient move by Karl McGowan, Bill Neville, your dad. But it's tough to be a trailblazer.
It is. Yeah. And there's a lot there in your question, just to talk a little bit about their position around, it's not the best players, it's the best players that play together as a team. That is it is a statement that was ahead of its time in those days, in the 70s and 80s. And one of the things that Doug had going for him, and also Neville, Bill Neville, his assistant coach, and Karl McGowan, is they lived through the 70s. And the 70s was a time where they learned what didn't work. And so Doug was a player on the national team in the late 60s and early 70s. And that's what the U.S. used to do. We'd pull together this group of all-stars, most of them from the LA, Southern California area, because that was just a hotbed of talent in volleyball at the time, still is, but it was really more dominant in those days. And they would get these all-stars together. They'd practice for a few weeks, go off to Europe, and they would lose to these teams that really gelled, that played together, that had this trust and respect. And so they realized that didn't always work. They needed to play together as a team. And I think the Herb Brooks example is great. He did that with the 1980 Miracle on Ice team. And that's been sort of legendary in sports now. And Doug did that as well. They really took a hard look at who they wanted on the team, that based on playing together and buying into the philosophy. And I think Chuck Johnson told Doug Beal early on, it's probably going to take one or two players to opt themselves out, because they're not going to be able to commit to the program before people really get the culture. And I think that did happen.
Yeah, and I think this is where kind of the beach and indoor overlap begins, because like I was telling you before we came on, is that this 1984 Olympic team, I think, is one of the most important teams in the history of beach volleyball in regards to both who made it and who didn't make it. Because we talked about how, St. John Smith was on the team, then he wasn't. Tim Hovland was on the team, then he wasn't, then he was, then he wasn't. Randy Stokos had a brief moment. Mike Dodd trained in Dayton for a minute. And then when they were cut, they were sort of freed up to go pursue beach volleyball and sort of to become the kings of the beach, so to speak. And then on the team who stayed was Chris Marlowe, who had won 2 Manhattan Beach Opens before he was on the team, wasn't on the team, back on the team, off the team, back and team captain, and Dusty Dvorak, Pat Powers. And it was really interesting for me because I wrote Kings of Summer with a lot of empathy for the beach players, because they're, like you mentioned, they had the attitudes, they wanted the creativity, and then somehow this outward bound trip that you went into great detail into, I think that sort of cut the ice a little bit, where you merge these two cultures of the Easties and the Westies, the East Coast players, the Ohio States, and the LA guys. How vital do you think that trip was in melding these two totally different cultures onto a pretty cohesive unit?
I think the outward bound was important, was an important element in the development of the team. And if you ask the players today, and I even put this in the book, some of them see it as being important. Some of them still wonder, did it really help us get to the gold medal?
Yeah.
But so I just want to, full disclosure on that if you got Paul Sunderland on this program, he might say, I'm not so sure it helped us. So it's not the only view. My view is not the only view on this, but from my perspective of watching teams, watching them develop, one of the key elements to a successful team is trust. I mean, this from studying beach volleyball, and, having two players, two partners that trust and work well together and bring out the best in each other. There's just something where it's the proverbial, the sum of the team is greater than the parts somehow. And when you can get that, that's where you win gold medals. That's where you win championships, is when you find partners that can do that. And the same thing in beach volleyball, maybe more so, because now we're dealing with 6 players and the rotation, and you need to find a team that plays well together. And it starts with trust and respect and people understanding their role. And so what the coaches did at some point, and there was some discussion with Doug Beal, Bill Neville, my father, Don Murray, Chuck Johnson, they got together and they said, we need to do something to get this team to work together. There were some cliques. There was the East Coast players. They called them the Easties. There was the Westies. The Easties were from Ohio State, and it was Mark Waldy, DeWillius, also, and Aldous Berzins. They had come from Ohio State. The rest of the team pretty much from LA. But then even with the LA team, you had the UCLA players, and you had the USC players, and we all know there was a massive rivalry between those groups. And Doug eventually had to tell them to not wear their college jerseys when they came to practice, because it would just cause too many problems. And so they didn't quite have that trust, whatever it was, respect, foundation, and they decided they needed a shared significant life experience together. Funny enough, they thought about going to boot camp. they thought, let's take these volleyball players to boot camp, which is sort of hilarious if you think about it. It could have been a totally different book if they'd gone to boot camp. But the Marines said, no, we're not putting your volleyball team through boot camp. So they ended up going on Outward Bound, which is not so much just an adventure in the outdoors as it is a course. It's a course that was designed to allow these players to learn how to survive out there on their own, which required them to rely on each other to survive. And that was part of the trust and development, the trust and respect that was developed, is because they had to work together. They learned how to read maps and how to orient, and they learned how to rock climb. And it was a knowledge transfer where you basically learned how to survive in the outdoors. And it was also 3 weeks in Utah in the middle of winter. So it was totally out of the comfort zone for these players. Like, the beach was where they thrived. Now they're in temperatures that got down to 5 degrees. They were hiking and snowshoeing up over 11,000 foot snow-packed peaks in the Abajo Mountains. They were snow camping. They were rock climbing. I mean, it was a grueling, challenging experience that created a lot of adversity. And that was the point. They had to work together to overcome the adversity, and they did.
And this wasn't just like a couple days. This wasn't a weekend Boy Scout trip. It started as a 28-day trip and they cut it to 21. And I was thinking, even 21 days. And I love backpacking and camping. I was like, 21's a long time out there in the cold.
Yeah, it was first designed in 28, and you can imagine the players' reaction. I talked with my dad. I talked with Bill Neville about, how did you sell this? And they said, oh my, we got in front of the team and we said, here's the plan. And the players thought they were nuts. They were like, are you crazy? We thought Doug Beal was crazy, but we didn't think he was that crazy. That's what Paul Sunderland told me. And, they through their just sheer willpower and resistance, they did whittle it down to 21 days, but it was still 21 days. I mean, 3 weeks is a long time out in the cold. I mean, this is January in the Abajo Mountains, which is near the Canyonlands National Park. They actually go up and over these mountains, and then they descended down into the park where they did some kind of almost canyoneering kind of hiking in the slick rock and the sandstone cliffs there. But this was a severe test, definitely. And halfway through, Dvorak basically said, "I'm done. I call it the breaking point when I talk about this trip." And Dusty was the setter of this team. He was, really the quarterback, so to speak, and the most important player, I believe. I know Karch Kiraly was an emerging talent at that time coming out of UCLA, and his potential was limitless. But at the time, Dvorak was just so central to their offense and everything. And there was this resupply truck that came, and Dusty said, I think I'm going to hop on this resupply truck and I'm out of here. Sorry, Doug, I'm done. I don't know why we're doing this. You can imagine the players are thinking, how am I going to get better at volleyball out here in the wilderness, snowshoeing? How's that going to help me play volleyball? And of course, we know now it's by helping them learn how to play together as a team. But Dusty said he was going to leave. So to Doug's credit, he said, okay, Dusty, you can leave. You're free to leave. But there's just two things. One, I want you to get in front of the team and tell them why you're leaving. And two, when you get back to San Diego and we all get back there and we start practicing again, there's no guarantee you're going to be on this team. And who knows if Doug was really going to let him go if he didn't. Who knows? Doug probably doesn't even know to this day. But that got Dusty to think about, well, how much he really wanted to be a part of this team, how important it was for him to achieve this Olympic dream through his teammates. And he told me, he said, I thought Doug would probably bring me back, but he said, I just didn't know. I knew that the players, I wouldn't have their trust and respect that I would need if I didn't finish this. And I would need that to be successful setter, to be a part of this team. We all have to be on the same page. And so I told myself, he said, I dug deep. I looked inside myself. I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be a part of this team. I'm just going to do what it takes to make it happen. And he did. And they did become a team. And I think, I call that chapter the breaking point, but I think it was also a turning point for the team.
Yeah. And it's funny how sports work like that, where often where you get to those breaking points, that's exactly where you do become a cohesive unit, which in a way, I don't think that Doug Beal had intended it to get that far south, but in a way, like, you do need to go through an adverse experience and that unites you. I mean, it goes back. I mean, any military book you read through, I think Sebastian Junger, I don't know if you've read any of his work, but when he wrote in Tribe, and that a lot of times it's the tough stuff that bonds you more than anything, just like most teams will get back together after a loss. We just saw in the World Cup, Argentina, they lost to Saudi Arabia to open things up. The biggest upset in World Cup history. They go ahead and win the whole thing. So I think the outward bound experience, while probably severe and took it to the limit, I think that ended up making that team come together, even though to this day, Sunderland might not necessarily agree, or Marlowe or some of those guys.
Absolutely. I thought about that, your reference to the World Cup and Argentina losing their first game, was it to Saudi Arabia, I think, right? Mm-hmm. Which is surprising, really surprising. And I thought, I wondered, how much did that loss make the victory possible? And just from having studied this 84 team, I think it was I'm sure it helped them. And I think Messi even said something to that effect, that it helped them, that sometimes the sooner you can get to that loss and learn from it, it's about being successful is often learning from failure and learning what you need to do to get better. And to Argentina's credit, they did. And I think this US team learned from that experience, and they started to develop something called the American system after they came back from this event, from this, overcoming the outward bound challenges. And it was a way of playing indoor volleyball that was unique and creative and innovative. And I don't think it would have been possible without the trust, because it required trying different things. And it also did a great job of bringing out the unique beach volleyball talent that was sort of inherent in this team. They grew up playing on the beach, and they had a different approach to volleyball than most teams in the world. And so the American coaches were sitting around scratching their heads. How do we get more out of Steve Timmons? How do we get more out of Pat Powers and Chris Marlowe and the way he would set on the beach? And so they found a way to do it.
Yeah. And so the American system that you explain in your book, they went about it in a completely different way, because volleyball at the time was played virtually sort of straight up, like the Russians. You were setting to the outside and they were going to be huge, right? But they were also huge. They still are huge to this day. But what the Americans did is they ushered in this new era of specialization, where instead of having 4 passers in the back row, they had Karch Kiraly and Aldis Berzins. They were passing. And to this day, Mike Dotz is Aldis Berzins is still one of the best passers ever. And I think one of the things I'm really curious about, because St. John Smith is obviously, an incredible passer, one of the best ball control players. If that specialization, if they had made this system earlier, if St. John would have been on the team as one of the best passers.
Yeah. Well, no, St. John was also a setter in college at UCLA. I think St. John and Karch set together in their system. And Doug said they really thought about using a 2-setter system on the American system for that 84 team. They ended up using just Dusty Dvorak. But, St. John, I think he was just incredibly talented at the time. And I think the challenge there was Doug Beal had put down some pretty severe rules about what he demanded of his players. And I think those rules, they seem sort of arbitrary and maybe unnecessary in today's world, but he felt they were really necessary at the time. One of them was no beach volleyball. One of the rules was, I don't want you, he said, you can play beach, but you can't play beach and be on this team. And I think that was a hard one for St. John. I think it was a hard one for Hovland. He also said no playing for money in Europe. He said, again, I wish you the best. Go sign the biggest contract you can, have all the success in the world, but we need to really work on becoming an indoor team. And we have so much work to do. I'm going to ask the players that want to commit to be here for the Olympics 5 days a week. We're going to play over 100 matches in a year. It's not like today where you could go off and play professionally and there was just windows you play on the national team. He really had the ability to say, you need to be in the gym. And, but that's a really good question about St. John. You'll have to get him on ask him, man, and get Doug Beal on, because that's a really good question of what might've been if St. John, because he would have fit in well, just purely on his talent to a system like that.
Yeah. There's so many what ifs, because we've mentioned Hovland a lot, and even when Hovland and Doug Beal, who butted heads probably as much as any player and coach I've ever seen, even Doug would say Tim Hovland was the best middle in the world, but he went over in Italy. And to see Hovland's perspective, it's not very hard, because he was like, I was making $500,000 in Italy playing against the best in the world instead of sleeping on a couch in San Diego, training against a bunch of bums from Ohio State. That's how Hovland would describe it.
I know I interviewed him for this book, and he made a really good case. He said, I was playing against better talent. He really believed he was doing the best thing for the team by playing in Europe. And if he could have got some more players over there. And I think, Doug would probably say maybe that would have worked too. Doug's pretty introspective, and he doesn't necessarily think that just because it worked out well, that it was the only way, or necessarily all of his decisions were perfect or anything like that. So he may very well second guess that one, but that is what happened. And Hovland was playing. I heard from all the coaches that they thought Hovland was the best player in the United States at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Was Hovland. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, which is amazing to think about that. I mean, we all know how great Hovland is and what an athlete he is. But that he wasn't on that team, and a lot of people thought Beale was crazy that he wasn't doing everything he could to get him on the team. Now, to Doug's credit, he was trying to do a lot to get him on the team. They both will say that. They'll say, I tried, they both tried to compromise, but they're both, I would say, pretty stubborn in their ways too. And I think they both admit that too, that they both wanted to compromise, but they're not people that compromise easily.
Yeah. Especially when both of them thought that what they were doing was best for the team.
Yeah.
I was like, I am being a team player by going playing against the best player in the world. And Beale's like, well, I'm doing what's best for the team by keeping you the same gym as the rest of the team. And so it's very easy to see both of their points of view.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of those, when as a writer, you have to sort of tell both sides of the story, and then, sometimes provide your point of view. But that was an interesting one. And that was, it's just, you have to make tough decisions as a coach. You have to make tough decisions as a program to move forward. And not everyone's going to agree with you. And one of the things that Doug said is we couldn't be afraid to look foolish. And he was accused of looking foolish, like putting two passers back there, putting Karch Kiraly and Aldous Berzins back to receive serve was unorthodox. It was really unheard of, especially the same two players. And, when they first rolled it out, it was, people thought it was a little strange. But he said, we're going to just try it. We're going to learn from it. We're going to try to grow. The same thing with someone like Hovland not being on the team. People thought that was foolish, but he ended up winning a gold medal, so these are just some of the tough leadership calls you have to make.
Yeah. And I'm curious, your process as a writer. So with Kings of Summer, when you're interviewing all these guys who are a little bit older, this was a long time ago, 1984 Olympics, is that Hov would have one side, Doug Beal would have a side, St. John's over here, Karch is here, Randy Stoklos is over there. So I have 5 different accounts of the same event that aren't adding up. And so I'm curious if you ran into any of that, because I ran into a lot of it. I mean, Kent, he cracked up at it and he goes, what do we do with this? So what the decision we made with Kings of Summer was to include everyone's perspective and let the reader make up their mind of what actually happened here. And I'm curious, when it had to have been inevitable that you ran into some of those contrasting accounts.
I have a lot of sympathy for what you and Kent went through, because I experienced the same thing. I remember talking to Doug about it. I talked with my wife about it. I'd say, I'm interviewing these players about the same event. I know it happened. It's just everyone thinks it happened differently, or why it happened. They have different accounts. And you learn a lot about human memory, about how we tell ourselves stories, and, where the truth is. You're always, as a writer, you're always trying to get to the truth. I had a mentor writer of mine who was a New York Times bestseller. And I brought this question to him, and he comes up through the world of journalism. And he said, just try to follow the truth. But sometimes you just don't know where the truth is, because you're hearing it from multiple people, but you just try to keep getting at the truth. And I think providing all the perspectives and letting the reader decide is a great one from a historical perspective. Yeah.
And it allowed, I think that was, as a writer, it was the fairest thing I could do, because I couldn't really pick sides, because I see St. John all the time. I really liked Doug and his honesty and his openness and his ability to make time. I was like, you guys are still butting heads about this stuff, but I'm not picking sides here. So here's St. John's side and here's Doug's side. Decide for yourself, reader.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun to write. What was your starting point as a writer? Where did you begin? Because a book is such a massive undertaking where it's really hard to narrow it down to the really small steps to get to that big goal picture.
Well, I started with, obviously interviewing everyone and getting as much data as I could. And then I started to think about, how do I tell a story that's interesting for a reader? Because readers want to get hooked into why is this book interesting? Why is it important? And so I did a lot of studying around narrative and plot. And even though it's a nonfiction book, you want there to be a plot that takes people through the journey of the hero's journey, so to speak, or through a journey of evolution with the team. And so that's why I decided to start actually in 1982. I decided to start the story there at the World Championships because the team was striving to be a better team. They wanted to be the top 3 in the world. Their goal was to medal at the 84 Olympics. This is 2 years before the Olympics. And they just have a sort of an epic failure. You know, they end up 13th at that World Championships. They had a chance to beat Bulgaria. They were up 12-5 in the 5th set, and they lost 16-14. This was side outscoring. And that was pretty devastating. You know, they didn't make it to the medal round, so the best they could do is get to 13th. And the reason I wanted to start there was it sort of makes it very clear that there was a problem. They had, look at the talent they had. You named off a few people with, you know, Dvorak yeah. and Powers and Craig Buck and Steve Salmons and Steve Timmons. I mean, this was one of the most talented teams that the U.S. has ever pulled together, and yet they weren't winning. And that was sort of the hook. I had to go back and tell a little bit of the backstory, like I said, of the 70s and why things weren't working and all of that, and get back to what they did to try to get better, which was Outward Bound and some other things in developing this American system. And then, of course, there's just some really interesting twists and turns and plot turns on their way to the Olympics, especially as they get closer, that you just don't see coming. And I had no idea about that part of the story when I went to learn about the team. And I kept learning new, interesting things that happened to the team as they got closer to the Olympics, that I thought, is this really true? I can't, it's better than fiction. But anyway, yeah.
What were some of the more surprising things that you uncovered?
Well, I think Chris Marlowe, just from a perspective of a human interest story, and Chris Marlowe is a very, very fascinating volleyball player and a figure in the sport of volleyball. And he's one of those players that whatever team he's on, it seems to win. I don't know if you read the article about Shane Battier by Michael Lewis. It was in the New Yorker, I think about 10 years ago. It's called the No Stat All-Star. But Shane was basically this, he was a great NBA player, but his stats weren't that great. But every team he played on, they won. And Chris was sort of like that. And so when I was studying Chris, he played basketball in high school from Pacific Palisades. They won the LA City Championships. Everyone I talked to said they had really no business winning the LA City Championships at the time, but they did. A lot of the credit went to Chris because when people went out on the court, they played better. He got them to play better somehow. And then he went on to San Diego State, and he played basketball and volleyball. And on the volleyball team, he was the captain, and they won an NCAA championship. It's the only team championship San Diego State has won in any sport.
Still since?
Since. Yes. This day, it's the only NCAA championship that San Diego State has. They don't even have a men's program anymore, which is very sad. But, he was the captain. Okay. And then he goes on to win these 2 Manhattan Opens that you talk about. He won with 2 different players. He won with, which was, I think it's a little more maybe normal now, but back then it was not normal to have to win back to back, right, or like he did, and have a different partner. It's, he was able to do it with 2 different players. And then he comes onto this team, and everyone I talked to just has nothing but great things to say about him as a teammate. He wasn't the most talented. He was older he was 32 by the 84 Olympics. He wrote Doug Beal a letter saying he wanted to get back on the team because he was on the team in the 70s. He was a teammate of Doug Beal's, but he wanted to be a part of this. And so he wasn't the most talented. He physically at the time, he was past his prime, but he brought something to the team. And then what ends up happening is he gets cut, not to reveal too much about the book, but he does get cut. Somehow, I won't reveal it all, but somehow he comes back and and they vote him a team captain. And so that whole, it just gives me chills to think about. And he was the captain, even though he didn't play a lot during the Olympics. I did have access to his journal, and you get to a little inside story of kind of some of the things he was doing behind the scenes, and they end up winning. And so it's sort of like his high school basketball team and his college volleyball team and now 84 team, the teams he was on tended to win. And he just brought that something special. I think we've all played with players like that. They have that something that they lift everybody around him, and he was able to do that.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'm wondering, and this will be a curiosity that will never be answered, is what does Chris Marlowe's life look like if Rod Wild doesn't break his leg? Because that's a hinge point in Marlowe's life. And so
it really
he gets
is
called back up and he's team captain, and then he wins a gold medal, and now he's, commentating for the Nuggets, and he just has this incredible career. And you just have these moments where it's just so important. Try Bourne, if he were here, I think what he would say is your best ability is your availability.
Mm-hmm.
And Marlowe, he stayed in shape. He got back on the team, and I love that the team immediately voted him team captain on a team where there's a lot of conflict. I feel like Marlowe was just beloved by all the teammates.
Yeah, they absolutely loved him, and so as soon as he was back on the team, they voted him captain, which I think says something about him and his leadership. And I think you're right. I mean, life throws you these things, and he got cut, but the coach said, stay in shape because you never know. And he did. And I think he got cut about 4 months before the Olympics. And so he said it was devastating, absolutely devastating. Everybody wanted to know why he was cut. But he stayed in shape, and he ended up, Rod Wild, who was the backup setter to Dusty Dvorak, ended up breaking his leg very tragically in Russia. It was too close to the Olympics for him to get back and play and recover. And so Chris gets this call. Chris, I don't know where his life would be, but I think he would be very, very successful. That's what I would say about that. Yeah. I don't know where. I don't know if he'd be at the Nuggets as the play-by-play announcer, but I do know that because of some of his intangible strengths and personality, I think he would be doing something amazing somewhere.
Did you talk to Rod Wild about the story?
I did. I talked to Rod, and that was a really tough time for Rod. Even now, the experience is very hard. And so what that taught me was, you see this feel-good story about the U.S. Olympic team, and you think it's just everyone's going to have a great feel-good experience. And then you talk to Rod, and his experience wasn't like, it didn't end the way he expected it to. And you realize that there's always two sides to life, and you got to deal with adversity, and you got to deal with the ups and the downs. And Rod had to deal with a very, very challenging injury that derailed him from being a part of a gold medal winning team. And he's still part of the sport, and he's still coaching, and he's still doing great. But I think it's just one of those things that's really hard to handle that.
Yeah. And then we have Karch, who's one of maybe the most important person in American volleyball history, both indoor and beach. I mean, he's won gold medals on both, and then he just won a gold medal in Tokyo as a coach for the first time. And I believe that was our women's first gold medal indoor ever. And I always love talking to Karch. I'm curious about your experience, because I think him and Doug Beal, they're able to look back at things unemotionally and pretty candidly. I'm curious about your experience just talking to Karch about all these memories. And because he skipped out on the outward bound experience, not necessarily his choice, but he was pre-med, and that's the only time he could take the course.
Yeah, as they were marching through the snow, they decided to rename the whole experience the March Without Karch, because Karch was taking pre-med and wanted to be a doctor. There was no professional volleyball there. He didn't really see a path for himself in volleyball, and not many people did at the time. That tells you where the sport was. And so he was studying pre-med and needed certain courses. And so they granted him a waiver from Outward Bound. But Karch is an amazing guy. One of the things that stood out for me about interviewing Karch is his memory. His memory is very good. He remembers a lot of details about what was happening in those days and conversations. So very sharp, extremely intelligent. And I think the thing about Karch that really stood out for me was what his teammates said about him at that time was that he brought a different mindset to the game every day, to practice. He set the expectation and the standard of how he was going to practice, how he was going to prepare. And he held himself to this really high standard. And then he held everyone else to that standard because he was holding himself to that standard. And I think it was Aldous Bursons who said, you either withered under that and just couldn't handle it, or you figured out how to try to raise your ability to try to match his ability. And I think like Marlowe lifted the team in a way of sort of building up people's confidence and believing in, getting people to believe in themselves and believe in the team, and just the way that he talked to people and would talk on the court. And it's very uplifting, positive. And then Karch brought this other element of lifting a team by just setting a very, very high bar of what we expect of ourselves and others. And that's, if you look at most championship teams, there's somebody like that on the team. Mm-hmm. There's someone. It wasn't Doug Beal saying, hey, you got to practice hard today. It was Karch practicing really hard and everyone looking around and saying, well, okay, if he's doing it, we better do it. And that's a big difference. And I think it's what separates the teams like, that are dynasties like this from other teams.
And I love the way you put it, because I think maybe one championship, maybe you can get away with that without a guy like Karch. But I think to form a dynasty, I do think you need a guy like that. It reminds me of The Last Dance. Did you watch The Last Dance with Michael Jordan docuseries? And there's that episode where where the players are asked at the beginning of the episode, is Michael Jordan a nice guy? And everyone's like, ah. But what Jordan's big thing was, I never asked someone to do something I didn't do. And he set the bar for excellence. And if you didn't meet it, he'd bark at you. But they won 6 championships because of it. And Karch is sort of like that Jordan-esque character, where I think he might not have been quite as big of an asshole on the court as Jordan was to his teammates a lot of times, but he drew out the best in everyone, and that's on the beach and indoors, and now as a coach for the U.S. women's national team.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. There's also a book written called The Captain Class.
Okay. That's been on my to-read list.
Yes, okay. Okay. I bet you'd
something.
Yeah, is it Walker, right? He's
yes.
He's a reporter for the Wall Street Journal.
Mm-hmm.
He got really interested in teams that were dynasties that were great for over an extended period of time. And one of those teams was the Celtics during their run in the 60s and 70s, and they had Bill Russell. I mean, and so he looked at all these teams and he tried to figure out what was the common factor. And was it a coach? Was it innovative strategy? Was it a really talented player? He ended up identifying someone called the captain that brought that mentality. Sometimes they were the best player, like Michael Jordan, but sometimes they weren't necessarily the star of the team, but they brought that in some way. And I mentioned Bill Russell because I think he really exemplified that. He was all about doing everything to help the team win and do all the little things. And so the neat thing about that book is he goes into detail on all the different captains from these teams. And it goes across women's sports, men's sports, all kinds of sports going back to the 1890s. It's pretty fun.
Yeah, I'm going to have to order that one because it's been on my to-read list for so long. Of course, my to-read list just gets longer and longer, and Captain Class keeps getting pushed down, but that'll remind me to bring it back up on the list. The cool thing about this team is that I think it had all those elements. It had the coach. It had the innovative strategy. It had both leaders, the vocal one in Chris Marlowe, who brought everyone together. But then you also had the star player in Karch, who also happened to be a good leader. I think it just had this rare alchemy that you don't see in sports too often. And that's what produces something special, like a gold medal after the team just a couple of years earlier was getting 13th at the World Championships.
Yeah. They went from perennial underachiever to the best in the world. And they did. They had a lot of the right elements. And it had a big impact on the sport. I mean, you mentioned earlier about just the impact this indoor team had on beach volleyball. And I think you could also make the case for just the impact that this team had on volleyball and putting volleyball on the map in the United States. The interest level in volleyball after that Olympics went through the roof. I mean, it was during that Olympics, they became the most popular team sport as far as the coverage from ABC Sports at the LA Olympics. Every night that they were playing, they would go to the highlights, or they'd go to different matches. They'd go in and watch parts of the match. And the US, basically fans across America started rooting for this team, and they just kept winning, and they went all the way to gold. And they really put volleyball on the map and laid the foundation for the next generation. And I think that's we should really be grateful for them as far as for the sport of volleyball, what they did.
Mm-hmm. What do you
there's
think?
A connection. One more quick thing. There's a connection between that team and the women winning through Karch, their first gold. And I know they've won medals in between, but their first gold came with Karch as their coach. And I think that's a great storyline from 84 to 2021 is when the Olympics, they won the gold, because it was the 2020 Tokyo Olympics that were delayed a year for COVID. But yeah, I think it's just a great story.
Do I hear a sequel coming
I
up?
hope so. That would be interesting.
I was gonna say, do you have plans to write another book?
I don't know what I'm going to write about next right now. I've been thinking about different aspects, and maybe looking at another team, or looking at just a single athlete, and like a long distance runner or someone like that, and look at it from the personal performance. And I'm throwing around some different ideas, but I'm still open right now.
Yeah. And a book it's a long and tiring process. There's a decompression process that you need. So this book was published in June?
July.
Okay. Was this your first book?
Yeah, it's my first published book. It was published by Rowman and Littlefield. And I don't come from a background of writing. I started writing about 12 years ago, just a blog, and writing about different aspects of my work and leadership and working with teams and organizations. And I developed that craft over a long period of time. Sort of, I've read your blog too, and I know you've been writing a long time. And as you know, if you like writing and you start doing more of it, you enjoy it, it's something that becomes sort of a habit. And that's how I got into writing. And I took on writing this book. You do really want to love the subject you're going to write about. I totally agree with what you just said. And I think that's why I'm going to be very discerning and not jump into anything unless I know that I really, truly love the story, and it's something that I want to bring out to others in the world, because it's a labor of love. It's not something that you're going to do for a lot of fame and fortune. It's about bringing stories in the world and channeling your own creativity. And so I know there's some other stories out there, and I'm sure I'll find the right one.
Yeah. I think Michael Lewis said it best. He came on Tim Ferriss's podcast one year, and he said that the only books I write are the books that I think I'm the only person in the world who can write. And so I've used that as my barometer for, do I want to take this project on? Would I like doing this? And do I think I'm the only person who could do this right? And so that's sort of my barometer of, will I take this project on?
Yeah, I think that those are great conditions to hold yourself to. And Travis, when I look at your books, I'd say that's very true of the books that you're bringing into the world, that you're uniquely placed based on your experience and your knowledge and your relationships and your network to tell these stories. And I think that it's a great gift to the world. So keep doing it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it kind of reminded me of Marlowe's Grand Slam that he talked about, and the 4 elements you need to win an Olympic medal. I feel like you also need the similar 4 elements to write a good book. You got to get a little lucky. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of people in the right place. When you get everything together, something good will happen.
Yeah, he got dealt 4 aces, he said,
yeah.
because he hit on all 4 of them at that Olympics. And yeah.
and what do you think that teams, because I think that this would be a great book for teams to read. I think it would be a good thing for a college program to pick up and have its players read. What do you think that, if the Texas volleyball team or Louisville or, Penn State, Pitt, whoever wants to pick this up, what do you think that they could learn from reading If Gold Is Our Destiny?
Well, I hope teams do pick it up. I think it will be helpful for teams. I just got back from the American Volleyball Coaches Association meetings last week, and Texas just won the national championship. I don't know when this is going to come out, but we're just taping a couple of days after that. And it was fun to watch the women play, and just blown away by the ability of all 4 teams that were back there. I did talk with a lot of coaches. A lot of coaches have already read it. Many haven't yet, and asked me about it. And I did do a presentation about the book. I think I think when you coach, there's really two big skills. One is understanding the X's and O's and the strategies, how you put a practice together, what kind of offense you're going to run, what kind of blocking scheme, and then how you teach those skills. And that's all really, really important. And I think most of what these coaches are learning when they come together at the AVCA conference, there's lots of clinics and meetings around these kinds of things. You also have to be a psychologist. You also have to understand the psychology, and they're not always trained in that. And they probably learn from all the coaches in their world, and they have their own style. But to be a good coach, there's some psychology involved, how you talk to your team, how you talk about how you set goals, how you communicate with one another, how you deal with failure after you lose, how you want your players to talk to each other on the court. These are all having to do with relationships, building trust, psychology. And I think you can learn a lot by studying this team. I'm not saying you take everything that this team did and you do it. You certainly don't go off 3 weeks and outward bound. You can't do that anymore. But, you can look for shared significant life experiences. You can look for ways to build relationships outside of the sport. You can look at ways to serve one another. I found that caring for one another as teammates is really important. That's something that they learn to do on Outward Bound. Just to survive a night, someone was cooking dinner, someone was gathering firewood, someone starting the fire, someone setting up the tent. So I think that's important. I'm a huge fan of Ted Lasso, that show, and I know that's fictional, but I think the reason it resonates and the reason that people love that show is we all instinctively know that to be a good leader, you need those two things. And what Ted Lasso brings is, he's a football coach from America, but of course he gets hired to be a football coach in England, which we know what that means, right? You're not going to be running your fullback right up the middle, between two blockers. And he's successful because they completely took the strategic tactical part away from Ted Lasso. And they said, the writer said, okay, let's just make this coach purely be psychological, building a culture and have some fun with that. And I think the reason it's so successful is we all know that intrinsically. And whether you could really do that or not, I don't know, but it reveals a truth. And that truth is, as coaches, you have to learn how to build a culture. And I think you can learn that in the book.
Yeah. And I think that Bill Neville is such an important character in that book because he was sort of the player's liaison. Doug Beal was like, I'm not going to get emotionally attached to these guys. And then you had Neville, who's sort of kind of trimmed the edges. He made it a little easier to talk to. And I love seeing just the dynamics. And I think that in retrospect, I think Doug Beal would maybe do some things different, but I think that him being the trailblazer and kind of maverick of a coach that he was so important because he figured out, okay, what worked, what didn't. And then 1988 win another gold medal. 92 maybe would have if Karch would have been there. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I'm glad you brought Bill Neville because I think he was an important part of that whole 84 team and winning gold. He was the assistant coach. There were two main assistant coaches that Doug Beal hired, Tony Crabb from Hawaii and Bill Neville. And the three of them became a great team working together. But Bill, the players absolutely love Bill. I mean, that was the one unanimous thing across the board was how much they really loved playing for Bill Neville and wanting to be their best. And of course they wanted to for Doug too, but he was emotionally distant. He wasn't that player's coach. He didn't want to build a relationship with these players that became too emotionally attached because he knew he was going to have to cut some of them. But Bill was just, you talk to Steve Timmons today and he'll talk about Bill and just what he meant to Steve and how he brought out the best in Steve. And I think just Neville had that ability and he still does. He's a really important part of the history of volleyball in America too, is that this incredible coach, Bill Neville, came along and brought that passion and energy to the sport. And I think the players all are indebted to him for what he did to get them prepared and ready to go.
Mm-hmm. And I think, go ahead.
Let me just tell one quick, I don't even know if I put this in the book, but Steve Timmons told me that he went on, after the 84 games, Steve was still playing for the national team and and Doug was no longer the coach, and Bill Neville was no longer the coach, but Timmons was on the team, and he was about ready to go on the court for, I think it was a World Cup or World Championship in China. And he just had this feeling he had to talk to Bill Neville. And so he ran to a phone and he calls Bill, who's sitting in his office in Bozeman, Montana, coaching for Montana State. I don't know how the time zones worked out or what, but somehow Bill answers the phone, and Steve says something like, "Hey, I'm about ready to go out there. Give me your pep talk. Psych me up here. I want to get stoked to go out there and do my best." So Bill does his best to kind of get him going. He says, but anyway, he goes, "Steve, you know how to do this yourself now. He's like the Karate Kid. He's like, I'm letting you go. You are Steve Timmons now. You can." But Steve still, remembers that fondly, that he actually called him up and said, "Give me some of those Nevillisms to get me really."
I love that. That's amazing. And there's one more anecdote from the book that I want to talk about before I let you go, is the inter-squad scrimmage in Pullman, Washington, where reading about it, this was what, 2-3 weeks before the Olympics?
Yeah, it was actually the 2 weeks almost exactly before the Olympics. They were up in Pullman.
And so they end up getting this youth night together, having this inter-squad scrimmage, and it gets really feisty and the intensity ramps up. And when I was reading it, what it reminded me of is the Dream Team and that inter-squad scrimmage they had that goes down in lore as one of the best basketball games that's ever been played. That was an inter-squad scrimmage, because no one competes like brothers and teammates. And I'm interested in your take on it. If that was important, if that drew sort of the best out of them, because it seemed like the coaches thought, now we're ready to win an Olympic medal.
Yeah, I thought about that Dream Team scrimmage too, and I have heard that characterized as the best game that's ever been played. I mean, who knows exactly what was happening behind the scenes there, but this team was really amped up and ready to play in the Olympics. At that point, they were peaking. They had not lost a game in 27 matches, something like that. They had beat the Russians on their home soil in the Soviet Union 4 straight, unheard of. We're talking about a dominant volleyball team that had won the World Championships in 82, Olympic gold medal in 80, the World Championships in 78. I think they took the silver in 76. They'd just been at or near and completely unstoppable for years. And all of a sudden, this wiry, agile bunch of beach players, trying a different system, go in there and beat them. And then they were going into not just their home country Olympics, it was really their hometown Olympics, right? Because 9 of these 12 players were from Southern California, between San Diego and maybe Santa Barbara, if you want to call that Karch's home. So we're talking about whatever distance that is, which isn't very far. All these players were from that area, and that's where the Olympics were being held. And all of their friends, all of their family, all of their teammates, there was a lot of interest. So you could just feel the energy as I was interviewing the players and learn. It was building. And that's why the coaches wanted to get them out of LA, because they were getting hammered for tickets, for access. And they said, no, we're going to do some isolation training, which I think just drove them nuts. I mean, they're out in Pullman, Washington. It's this little town in Eastern Washington surrounded by wheat fields. There's nothing out there, absolutely nothing, except for a college, which even at that in the summertime, there's no one there. So it was like, they just pulled them out of LA and put them in the middle of nowhere. And they were forced to kind of think about volleyball all day long. And Karch says they were at their wits' end, but they were so competitive. They were so competitive with each other that one of their scrimmages just boiled over. And I mean, the sport better than I. Is trash talking a part of the sport, Travis?
Oh, it is quite a big part of the sport.
Yeah. So the trash talking started and it kept going. And the night you're talking about, I think it was the youth night, and they brought in all these young kids because they gave away all these tickets. So it was youth night, and the coaches it was getting embarrassing because the coaches were listening to these F-bombs and things getting thrown around the court. And it almost broke the team apart. I mean, I think they were close, because things were said that may have crossed lines there, but I think Marlowe brought him back together. And I think they realized, we're so competitive. If we can just bottle this competitive nature up and then release it against the teams that were our competitors at the Olympics, we're going to be unstoppable. And they were. And so they figured out how to sort of forget about the intra-squad competitiveness and rechannel it at these teams that they met in the Olympics, and they went on a run.
Yeah. And I was cracking up reading it because you did such a good job of really painting the picture. And I was just imagining Marlowe and his kind of snipey little trash talk, and Karch, he's so intense, veins popping out of his neck.
Yeah.
It's very fun to read.
I guess you didn't want to trash talk with Marlowe unless you really had your A game trash talking ready to go, because he was a world-class trash talker and you can only imagine. I mean, that's what he does for a living. He talks sports all day long, not necessarily trash talking, but he verbally is a magician, so he was you just didn't want to mess with the guy that way. And someone poked the bear or the lion or whatever he was. And, yeah, I wish I could have been there for that one. That would have been fun. Bill Neville saw that, and he saw a team ready to go. This is one of those where two coaches saw something different. Bill said, Doug looked at it and said, "Oh my gosh, we're breaking up. What's going to happen?" Things were said that we can't take back. How am I going to bring this team together? And Bill said, "No, what we just saw was a team that is absolutely ready to go kick some butt." And, this is the best thing that could have happened, because we now know that they are ready. And luckily Bill was right. And Doug, who was the consummate warrior, was wrong on that one. And it ended up working out just fine.
Ended up working out historically fine. First gold medal in history. And I know that this is, for our listeners, this is a beach volleyball podcast and there's a lot of indoor stuff. But like I said, so many beach players, I think all beach fans will enjoy it. And it's off season anyway, so it's time to chat indoor stuff. And Sean, I thought you did an excellent job painting a really fun history of the sport and of that team in particular. And I think that it's both entertaining for people just looking for an entertaining read during the off season, and you'll take a lot away. I mean, I learned a lot. And I'm sure that you did as well. And I'm sure you'll probably be applying a lot of those practices to your own business.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm pulling out lessons and telling stories to business clients around how you build a team, just based on some of the interesting steps and decisions that this team made collectively and with the coaches to become better and to figure out how to become the best team they could be to reach their potential. And I think we can all learn from it.
Mm-hmm. And so where can our listeners, get the book, and where can they find you and follow you and keep up with everything that you're doing?
Well, the book is available on Amazon. If Gold is Our Destiny, How a Team of Mavericks Came Together for Olympic Glory, or just about anywhere you can buy a book online, you can find it there. You can also find me at Sean P. Murray. It's SeanPmurray. That's my website. And you can find out more about the book and some of the things that I'm doing and writing at that web address.
Awesome. Well, Sean, it was a great read. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks for coming on. I'm glad 6 months later we could make this happen. And I'm glad the book is doing well. Congrats on the book as well. It's a big project. I'm excited to read your next one.
Thank you, Travis. It was really wonderful to be on the show. I love the show. I love what you're doing in your writing too. And thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Thank you very much. Well, have a great Christmas. Happy New Year.
Same to you.
All right. Bye, Sean.
Bye.